Good evening. I'm Rabbi Joshua Davidson, Senior Rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, and I'm honored to welcome you tonight. The Temple Emmanuel Stryker Center is proud to offer exciting and important programs addressing the fullest range of Jewish interests, from politics to food, film to song, history to comedy, and literature to archaeology. Over the last 11 painful months, Emmanuel and its Stryker Center have hoped to engage our many thousands of followers, to lift your spirits because we've all needed it, and to challenge you. Indeed, one of our most important responsibilities is to address the pressing issues of our time, and tonight we shall. The Bible reminds us the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. If we take the words of the 24th Psalm at all seriously, then protecting this planet and its inhabitants becomes a religious imperative. Bill Gates, creative genius and business pioneer, and in partnership with his wife Melinda, philanthropic giant, is determined to sharpen the world's attention on the cause of environmental justice and specifically the climate crisis. A danger he began to focus on 20 years ago after visits to Africa to fight poverty and disease. Through years of study on global warming, he has developed a broad plan for getting us to zero carbon emissions in a cost-effective manner. That plan is the basis for his new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need. He wrote it, he says, because I don't just see the problem, I also see an opportunity to solve it. And we are delighted to host him and its launch this evening. As the book came out just today, the bookseller tells us your copies will arrive within a week if you have not received them already. Tonight, Mr. Gates will be joined in conversation by Trevor Noah, one of America's most acclaimed comedians and satirists, whose brilliant humor and insight have kept many of us going through this most difficult year, and whose work on The Daily Show has earned him multiple Emmy and Peabody nominations and awards, and a social media following surpassing any other late night host. In a moment, I'll turn the screen over to them. And when I do, you can submit questions via the chat function. But first, we set the stage for tonight's conversation with this short video presentation.
In a typical year, the world emits over 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases. And as we keep doing that, the consequences for human life will be catastrophic. When I first fell in love with computers as a teenager, they were enormous, expensive, and only the government and big companies could afford them. But my friends and I became obsessed with a wild idea. What could we do if there was a computer on every desk? And now the wild idea is quite tame. Billions of people not only have computers on their desks, but even in their pockets. Now the world needs another breakthrough. In fact, it needs many breakthroughs. We need to get from 51 billion tons to zero while still meeting the planet's basic needs. That means we need to transform the way we do almost everything. Our commitment to developing these innovations will mean the difference between a future where everyone can live a healthy, productive life and one where we're constantly dealing with the human and financial crises at a historic scale. Entrepreneurs and investors have to build new businesses and change existing businesses to get these solutions deployed. Government leaders have to enact new policies that drive the market for clean energy, and advocates have to keep their voices loud to hold all of us accountable for rapid progress. Avoiding a climate disaster will be one of the greatest challenges humans have ever taken on. Greater than landing on the moon, greater than eradicating smallpox, even greater than putting a computer on every desk. And my basic optimism about climate change comes from my belief in innovation. It's our power to invent that makes me hopeful.
Well, good evening, everybody. I think we're on. This is an interesting forum for me. I'm used to being in a more controlled setting, but now I'm just chilling by myself, waiting to have a conversation with a friend who wrote a book, a man by the name of Bill Gates, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And so for all intents and purposes, just think of this like a FaceTime that I'm having with a friend of mine. And we're just going to be chatting about a book that he wrote and hopefully having a conversation about how to save the planet, which is a pretty important conversation to have with your friend over FaceTime. Usually it's more about how tough your week has been at work and how you need to get out of the house because you now hate everybody who you loved before the pandemic because you spend 24 hours a day with them. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce my friend and author, Bill Gates.
Hey, Trevor, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic, sir. Nice to see you again. How are you?
Good. Excited that this is the day the book came out.
Yes, indeed. We can get straight into it because my first question for you is this. Why? Let's start with the why of the book. Why does Bill Gates need to write a book about avoiding a climate disaster? I mean, surely you have other things to do. Computer things to make, crazy ideas to come up with. Malaria is not finished. Why climate disaster?
Yeah, my full-time job since retiring from Microsoft is at the Gates Foundation. And as you say, that's about malaria and infectious diseases. And in fact, our foundation, because we're experts in vaccine factories and quick development of billions of vaccines, the pandemic has had us extra busy. Climate's something that I started looking at as I was traveling around Africa for the foundation and thinking about electrification, and realized I didn't know enough about the constraint of climate change. You know, I knew that you weren't supposed to build coal plants, but I didn't really get what else would have to change and how that might affect Africa. I also wanted to know how bad climate change would be for Africa. I mean, after all, the poorest there are mostly farmers and often near the equator where the temperature rise is getting to levels that could prevent the crops from growing. And, you know, when you have crop failures, it creates not only malnutrition, but great instability. And you've got population growth there as well. So, you know, I followed this. I learned a lot about it starting in 2005. I have two TED Talks that are well known, Climate in 2010 and We're Not Ready for the Next Pandemic in 2015. But the thing that triggered me to write this book was that the interest level of the younger generation has gotten very high. We saw that in the political discussions on the Democratic side. And so you've got this enthusiasm and you've got this goal to get to zero by 2050, but there really isn't a plan. You know, people aren't aware of all the sources. They aren't aware of the need for innovation. And so I thought, since my whole career has been about innovations, although in different domains, I thought this was a good time to lay out some of the key metrics and how you get in that 30-year time period, all these innovations scaled out.
What I appreciate about the book is that you are obsessive is the best way I would describe it. You know, whether it's figuring out your forehand in a tennis game or thinking about how to get software into a computer on every single person's desk in the world, or figuring out how to eradicate malaria, you have a mind that obsesses. You get into a topic, you dig as deep into it as possible, you try and speak to all of the greatest minds in and around the subject matter. But what I appreciate here is you distill it down for us, which I appreciate because I like to obsess about different things, and then I like experts to write about the things that they're obsessed about. So let's talk about this book, and let's start at the beginning. I love that you start the book off very early. This might be my favorite part of the book, is where you say, I'm aware that I'm an imperfect messenger on climate change. The world is not exactly lacking in rich men with big ideas about what other people should do or who think technology can fix any problem. And I own big houses and fly in private planes. In fact, I took one to Paris for the climate conference. So who am I to lecture anyone on the environment? And then you say, I plead guilty on all three charges. Let's talk a little bit about that. acknowledging that you're an imperfect messenger, but understanding how big this crisis is. And then you go on to lay out what you're doing about that. So let's start with that. Is why does an imperfect messenger feel like this message needs to be spread?
Well, the short-term goals, where you talk about a 20% reduction or 25% reduction, those are great, but they cause you to focus on the easy parts. So like passenger cars, even though there's a lot more to do, Tesla's a great product. GM announced recently in 2035, they're going to stop making gasoline cars. And so because there's enough volume there and enough innovation, the cost of the batteries, the range, even the number of places you can charge, how quick you can charge, over this time period, it's going to be the electric car, the green car, is not going to be more expensive. And that's, what you want to do across all these activities. But people aren't aware of the number of those activities, like, cement. Who pays attention to cement? It's kind of a solved problem, very cheap. Why visit that? Why change it at all? It seems to work, and yet, sadly, that's a huge source of emissions. It's almost as much as passenger cars. Likewise, making steel that we use in buildings, that's almost as much. Cows that we use for ground beef and steak are almost as much. And so I thought, we've got to lay this thing out and be honest that it's going to be very, very hard. Anybody who thinks it's easy isn't going to help us develop the will to do it. Anybody who thinks it's impossible or unnecessary, they're a problem too. What we need is people who believe in the goal and see that it's 30 years of prioritizing this very highly. That's the only way that we're going to get there.
Well, let's talk about getting there. Oftentimes I find, and maybe it's because my mother taught this to me, that in order to get somebody's investment in an idea, you have to make them understand the stakes. And so for myself, I understood that if the dishes weren't washed and if my room wasn't cleaned, the stakes were my video game console would magically lose the power adapter that would turn it on. So I understood the stakes of the house being clean. What are the stakes of us failing to achieve these numbers? Because I understand how most people live in a world where they say, I get it, Bill Gates, what are you saying? Maybe there's going to be a few more snowstorms here and there. Maybe some days are going to be hotter than other days. It doesn't seem like a big problem. So why should we be this urgently acting on something that doesn't really seem like it's going to be that much of an issue? I can wear a hat or I can wear a jacket. Why do we need to change the world for that?
Yeah, it's a very good point, because if your mom had said, hey, I'll take your video game away from you a year from now, you might have said, okay, I'll worry about that when it comes. And climate change, although we can already see sea level rise, more storms, wildfires, crops not growing as well, particularly in the South. It's easy to ignore that decades from now, it'll be killing 5 times as many people as the pandemic is killing, and getting worse every year. And so the idea that we have to invest now across a lot of areas, and we have to engage basically all the countries, this is a very difficult problem. As you put greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere, sadly, CO2 stays there for thousands of years, and it causes the temperature to rise. And so it's the sum of all the emissions, even going back to when we first started burning coal, that is that temperature forcing. And so as long as you're putting any in, the temperature is just going up. And that means that near the equator, the farmers are having terrible problems, that coral reefs are all dying, the Arctic ecosystems are going away. It's all really very quick that the temperature is going up, and so nature can't adjust. And a lot like the pandemic, the poorest are the ones who get hit the hardest here, whether it's in the United States or outside the United States. And so you do have these doom and gloom books, which sadly tell the truth. I have some of that in there, but I don't dwell on that, because I want to say, okay, here's how we avoid those problems.
Right. This book is all about solutions and the ideas for what we can do to prevent ourselves from getting to a place where the planet is uninhabitable for us as human beings. So I wanted to talk about the 51 billion tons to zero. That's where the book really kicks off. And it seems like a number that you're really trying to drill into our minds. 51 billion tons, 51 billion tons, 51 gigatons, but the billion tons becomes easier to think about. Why zero? You know, you always hear people saying, oh, we got to get to zero emissions, zero emissions. But first of all, why zero? And secondly, is zero even an achievable thing? Do we want to live in a world with zero emissions? Does that mean no more barbecues, no more roasting marshmallows? What is zero?
Yeah. So if you look at the curve of these emissions, it almost entirely just goes up. There's a few wiggles, like, you know, when you have the financial difficulties, and of course the pandemic, we haven't fully measured last year's emissions, but they're probably down about 8%, which is actually not that much. You know, if you, with this growth and this goal to get to zero by 2050, we almost have to have that amount of reduction every year from now on. And yet, you know, you think of all the things people have given up and what that's done to the tourism industry, or, you know, restaurants, are huge numbers of activities. The reason for zero is that long residence time, that the CO2 is sitting there warming the earth for so long. And you're right, there will be some emissions. We can offset those with a technique where you filter the air. It's called direct air capture, where you pull the CO2 out of the air. It's very expensive right now, over $600 a ton that you pull out. Among the wild companies that have brilliant ideas, there's 5 or 6 of them that are trying to bring that cost down so that we can do more of that direct air capture, since in a way that's kind of the ultimate. For anything else you can't do more straightforwardly, like electric cars, you could just fund this direct air capture. But even at $100 a ton that we haven't achieved, you know, with today's emissions, that's $100 times 51 billion, so 5 trillion a year. You know, clearly the world isn't going to come up with that. And so we need new ways of doing things, you know, so that number really starts to come down. And if you get it down to zero by 2050, then you only have a little less than 4 degrees Fahrenheit average temperature rise. And that, you know, that would limit the damage. If we could get it done earlier, of course, that's even better. 2050 is kind of the best, the earliest possibly achievable date for this thing. You know, so if anybody says, oh, we can do this in 10 years, they're not paying attention to the scale and the number of sources. You know, we can ban gasoline cars by 2035. So, you know, once all the gasoline cars are gone, you know, there's you know, 7% of the problem that's solved, and that's the one that we're furthest along with.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. I really enjoy in the book how you break this down into a digestible manner. You know, we get to understand, because I've always understood climate change on a large level, you know, and I think most people do. We understand it the way we see the montages. You know, you see the factories pumping out the fumes, you see the cows farting in a field, you see the people driving in traffic, and we go, okay, this is climate change. We need to stop this pollution so that we can try and reverse the effects of climate change. But what I enjoy here is when you talk about the 5 questions to ask in every climate conversation. You say, 1, how much of the 51 billion tons are we talking about? 2, what's your plan for cement? 3, how much power are we talking about? 4, how much space do you need? And 5, almost most importantly, how much is this going to cost? Let's start with that number 1 question. It's maybe one of the most fascinating ways to look at the problem that I've ever seen. How much of the 51 billion tons are we talking about? And that question is in and around, how effective is this going to be? So we might think, and you talk about this in the book, we might think, oh, you know, we really need to stop the cars and the airplanes. That's our biggest problem. But as you talk about here, and as the numbers have shown, the efficacy of what we're doing might not yield the results that we want. So talk me through that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so if we were only trying to reduce this by 20 or 30%, then particularly in rich countries, we could drive smaller cars, make our houses smaller, eat less meat, and you could get that kind of reduction. And those things are helpful. I'm all for particularly rich countries cutting back. That's helpful. But the scope of the thing that I got a slide that hopefully you're seeing that has those 5 areas of emission. Electricity, people know about, coal's a lot of that, but even natural gas. Transportation, people think about cars, but trucks are much harder. Buses, air travel, ships. The ones that people don't know about, heating and cooling buildings, where today we use natural gas for a lot of that. Agriculture, there's the cows in there making fertilizer, moving things around. But the biggest single one of all 5 is this manufacturing piece, the industrial economy that is so cheap and reliable that, who's been there and who's figuring out new ideas. That's 31% of the whole problem. The biggest 2 subcategories are that steel and cement, but paper, plastic, kind of, if you look around you, there's everything you're seeing is a emission intensive process. And if you think of all those factories that do all that kind of work, every one of those has to change for zero emissions. So that, I'd say that's the hardest of all.
So when we look at changing these things, are we going after companies? Are we going after companies that produce cement? Are we going to steel manufacturers, and are we telling them you have to become more efficient in how you do this, or you have to become more green? And then is that enough? Because I mean, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think governments are responsible for the most production of things. We oftentimes think of a government as just running whatever the laws are going to be, but they're making things, they're producing things, they're growing things, they're working things, etc. The roads, the asphalt, the cement, they're building, they're producers and they're buyers of some of the most steel in the world. So then the question becomes, who are we meant to be aiming this conversation towards to make the biggest impact? And secondly, are they receptive to it?
Yeah, so if something costs a lot more right now, how do we even get started? And there, we did have some governments, Germany and Japan, who bought solar power even when it costs more. And so they got the industry going. There was lots of competition. And with that volume, the price came down. And that is such good news. The lithium ion batteries that are used in electric cars have come down in price, not like chips, but still pretty good. Solar and wind, land-based wind, have come down a lot. So those are components of the solution. In these other areas, you've actually got to fund government R&D. And sadly, the R&D on these topics really hasn't gone up hardly at all. Started to a bit in 2015, where I joined world leaders at the Paris Climate Conference, and we brought that topic into the climate discussion for the first time. And that's, new ideas come out of the universities and the labs. Then we want to fund those crazy ideas before they can form a company. We want to help fund companies, even if they're high risk. And then we also want to fund the buying of these green products. So your point about the government builds roads, we'd like the government to, maybe say, okay, 5% of the cement has to be this no emission green cement. And yes, they'll pay a bit more, but that helps bootstrap it. California has done some good things. They required zero emission vehicles, which influenced the car manufacturers. They have a subsidy for low carbon fuels, whether it's car fuels or aviation fuels. So there's a lot of companies using that market as how they get going on this. The greenness, sadly, the person who buys the steel, it's just the same steel. And it's not like software where you can add a few cool features and appeal to different buyers. Here, the green stuff actually is slightly different. And so people are afraid, will it last as long? Should they change the building code? These are industries with very low R&D levels and huge conservatism. When a rate commission that controls what the electric companies, the utilities do in building plants, they to get a proposal for something that's risky, they have to think, well, for our ratepayers, should we just do it the normal way without risk? Unless everybody's doing this climate change thing, just having one utility get out in front wouldn't matter. So you're absolutely right. Policy has got to drive these industries. The tax credit for the electric car is a great example. There were tax credits for wind and solar. Now we need to redesign those for steel and cement and storage and aviation fuel. And we're just getting started in the US. People do expect us to lead because we have more greenhouse gases than anyone, and we're the richest country in the world, and lots of power to innovate.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, the US now has a new administration who has said, that their goal is going to be climate change. Joe Biden has repeatedly said one of his number one goals is going to be fighting climate change. Now, yes, the US is one of the biggest polluters in the world, but the US is still part of the world. So then my question is, beyond just being a quote unquote leader, what does the world do? I mean, if America says, yes, okay, we're going to step up and reduce our emissions, who's to say that other countries around the world will do this? I mean, you and I are both familiar with many developing nations who say, hey, we can't join into your fancy Paris Accords, and we can't join into any of these benchmarks because we're trying to hit our growth numbers. We're trying to get our GDP up there. We want to produce more and make more, and we can't even be involved in this world of green steel and green cement and electric cars. We just got electricity. So yes, America might be doing one thing, but how do you then scale that out to other countries in the world that may not have the financial standing to take these financial gambles in the world of green?
Yeah, so that's a super good point. I always think about India because they're going to add a lot of electricity capacity, and not for extravagance, just for basic lights at night, or because it's getting so much hotter there, they need air conditioning just to make their houses livable. And so in 2050, as India is making a choice, should they use green cement or normal cement? Should they use, coal power plants versus other things? The extra cost to be green better be very low, because the US isn't going to send trillions of dollars to India to subsidize those things. So a brute force approach using today's technology, it would be trillions. And so India's going to say, hey, if you don't subsidize it, we're just going to, get going, and this is your problem to solve. And we just it won't be affordable. So I think, that 5 trillion, which is the total green premium right now, innovation has to bring that down a lot, like 95%. Then that remainder, that is affordable. The rich countries helping out India and helping out countries poorer than India with these activities, that would be feasible. But brute force is not what we owe the world. We owe the world the innovation, because even if we zero out our 15%, the amount of increase from countries that don't have the basic and have population growth, they will make our progress unimportant unless we're helping them do the same thing. Now, most countries are ahead of us. They didn't withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. Europe's very strong on these issues. Even China has a goal of 2060. Now, we'd like them to stop building coal plants and get it done a bit earlier. So the relationships with China on this one and with India need to be cooperative, where we're helping each other.
We live in a world where oftentimes, through very slick campaigns and PR moves, people have shifted the blame of many of society's ills onto the individual. So people have made it seem like recycling, this is your duty as an individual. When if you really do the research, you come to realize that we have to try, just like we do with climate, figure out the supply side of what's coming in versus Trevor separating his plastics and his cardboards. You have always talked about this. You've talked about how these problems are so much bigger than a few people chipping in. But the question I then ask you is, especially after reading this book, I felt a little bit helpless. I was like, well, Bill Gates, I want to stop all the cows. How do I stop all the cows? I want to make clean cement. I don't know. Does Gorilla Glue help? I don't know. I would love to know, as an individual and as people who have a stake in the planet, what can we do if we do not control the levers of power?
Yeah, I'd say there's three things that come down to the individual. The first is your political voice. And I'd say that it's not just your voice, it's convincing other people, educating them. And, ideally, this becomes a bipartisan issue, particularly amongst the younger generation. We're already seeing record levels of interest, but unless that's intensified and maintained, the will to do hard things won't be there. So that's number one. Number two is you're a consumer. You may not own a car, Trevor, but a lot of people own cars. And buying an electric car drives up the volume, drives the competition, and make sure that over time that extra cost, that grain premium, is going to come down. You buy ground beef, and now we have many companies, Impossible Foods, Beyond Burgers, most of the burger chains now. It's there on the menu. When it first got on, there was actually quite a few people who, for health reasons or animal cruelty or climate reasons, chose to pay a little bit extra. And as they do that, those companies will do more R&D. They'll produce more volume, and they'll get the price down and the quality. I expect, in a decade, you won't be able to tell the Impossible product from the real thing. You just won't know. And yet one of them is far, far better for the planet. So there's a lot of consumption. Finally, as an employee, you're part of an organization. What are they doing about aviation fuel for their trips? Are they reporting their numbers? Or as they build new buildings, are they willing, at least to some degree, to pay these premiums? And so, as part of an all-out effort, you've got to exercise all three of those roles in order for this movement to succeed.
So we're living in a world that is changing. And you talk about how those 2 degrees could change the face of the planet as we know it. How often we can go outside, how many days of the year we can consider work days or outdoor days, or, even the smallest things, how long your car can stay parked on a hot piece of asphalt. It will change everything in our lives. But Bill Gates, I do not need to tell you this, but I will, because we're having this conversation. We live in a world where, as people, we consistently fail the marshmallow test. I'm sure you're familiar with it. They gave the children the marshmallow, said if you eat the one marshmallow, you don't get another one. If you wait, we'll bring you another one. One thing we've learned is, as society, we generally have a limited ability to resist the urge to eat the marshmallow now. Now, just like the marshmallow test, for those who don't know, they did find that the kids' backgrounds determined a lot of why they ate the marshmallow or didn't. So were they told that their peers were eating the marshmallow? If they said the other kids didn't, then they were less likely to eat the marshmallow. Were they told that they would be a good kid if they ate the marshmallow or not? That would determine their reaction as well. So when we talk about the people now who are on the ground, the people who are making these decisions, the people who might get into power, the people who might elect the people who get into power, what is their incentive? Some might say, genuinely, well, I'm not going to be around, so why should I care? Others might say, I've been hearing about rising sea levels for the last 15 years, and the sea is still exactly where I left it, so I don't know if this is a real thing or not. You are the person who gave a TED talk on pandemics and how we're not ready. And I'm sure you saw firsthand when that came to fruition. Not only did many people, luckily not most, but many people not say, we were wrong or we didn't think about it. They turned around and blamed you, where the phrase comes from, shoot the messenger. So you are once again the messenger. My question to you is, how do we get this message heard?
Yeah, I think the marshmallow test is very informative there, where if a lot of young people are saying, hey, here, this is a moral cause that's beyond my individual success, almost a religious-like commitment to say, hey, let's preserve these natural ecosystems. Let's not make large parts of the earth unlivable. I think that will catch on, and I hope, and I think in a bipartisan type way. So they have to latch on to this movement even more than they have. But I will say the pandemic, usually you would have expected it to kind of interrupt an interest in things far out. We haven't seen that. We've seen actually increased commitment, including wanting to build back better, using the investment dollars there to get really accelerating these climate initiatives. Government, we do count on them to tell us a building code so that when the earthquake comes, our buildings don't all fall down. And that costs money. We fund the Defense Department so that we're ready if we get attacked. The two examples we're talking about, the pandemic, the government did not make the small billions of investments that would have saved these trillions of dollars. They clearly, weren't paying enough attention and are just rated the risk as too low. And so, being able to say, I told you so, doesn't really help at all. Now I want to make sure that we do the right thing so that when the next one comes, we'll be okay. Climate, sadly, once you get into the difficulties, you can't just invent a vaccine and then boom, wait a year or so, and you're finally, able to be back where you were. This one, in terms of the difficulty of solving it and the negative effects, is much worse, but it's out there. That leg is troubling, and there are days, I think, will we show humanity enough fortitude now, that means doing things often a harder way now in order to get the benefits of the livable earth out there in the future. And so highlighting the weather events is super important. I think that's partly why we're better on this now, but the will have to be very, very strong.
The will, where there's a will, there's a way, is what my mom would always say. It's time for us now to move into the audience Q&A. A lot of people would love to ask you some questions. Everyone has an idea of what they think climate change should or shouldn't be, or how the fight should be tackled. And so I'm going to be reading some of the people's questions. Everyone who's watching and you've written them out, thank you very, very much. If I mispronounce your name, forgive me, I have an accent. Let's start with Ruth, who says, Bill, I live in rural Michigan, the heartland who elected Mr. Trump, and honestly believe that he was robbed of the re-election. These people honestly believe that the climate has changed in the past, and this is nothing out of the normal process. How do I open a conversation with them and remember that this is almost half of the country?
Yeah, we have to find, who do those people trust? Of the climate scientists out there, many of them are evangelists or have strong connections in the community whose immediate reaction is, oh, isn't this just for liberals? Or, is this kind of an elite thing where they're always making it sound complicated and, it's going to make things expensive for me. The communications challenge here is a super important one. And, my expertise is more on the innovation side, but, some of my funding is going out to people who have ideas about getting into these different communities. It can't just be 4 years of progress, stop for 4 years, 4 years of progress. You can't redo the cement and steel business like that because the capital amounts involved. Just building the transmission lines for the electric network, getting permission to do that, that's like a 10-year process that can't be start and stop, or it's just too risky. So you're absolutely right that finding common ground, that the goal is okay, and then disagreeing about the tactics to get there, that will be important. In the US right now, of all countries, is in the toughest shape on that.
Here's a question from Amber, who says, I'm a 6th grade student and my science fair project was on biofuel and how to enhance the efficiency. What type of alternative fuel do you think will have the most potential of replacing fossil fuels?
Yeah, so for passenger cars, the battery is good enough. The energy density is not 20th as good as your gasoline tank, but your gasoline tank is fairly small. So the fact that the batteries have to take a lot more weight and space, that works in the passenger car. But when you get to a big truck going long distances or a plane, it doesn't. And so the idea that we can make these fuels, but not use the carbon that's been underground, but rather use plants or somehow grab the carbon from the CO2 and use that to make fuels. So we have biofuels, or that second approach is called electrofuels. I'm a big customer, the biggest individual customer for some vegetable-based fuels that are used in planes now, and that I'm using to offset my carbon footprint, and that's working very well. Now I'm paying more than double the price. That's a huge green premium. But I hope that by buying that, it over time gets scaled up. It gets available at more airports. It's very tiny thing today. So biofuels and electrofuels are very promising. The electrofuels, if we could make hydrogen really, really cheap and green, that would help that approach. Right now, the biofuels are slightly less expensive, and so that's why I'm buying about 7 million a year of these different offset activities.
Here's a question from Jean or Jean. I'm going to bet Jean. Why is cement a problem? How does it contribute to pollution?
Yeah, it's a super good question. So the way cement is made, there's this limestone that almost everywhere in the world within 20 miles, you can find a bunch of limestone, because whenever there was like a coral reef from the past, eventually that turns into limestone. And you take limestone and you have to heat it up to 1400 degrees, and then it separates into calcium, which is the key ingredient of cement, one of them. But it emits CO2. So you have two ways you're making CO2. One is to burn usually natural gas to get all that heat. And the second is that chemical separation of the limestone to pull out the calcium releases a lot of CO2. So for every ton of cement you make, right now, there's a ton of CO2 released into the atmosphere. So if you have to pay over $100 a ton to pull it back out, that doubles the price of the cement. Now people are looking at, okay, can we make concrete with less cement? A lot of ideas, and a few companies are showing us how we can get 10 to 30% reductions, but we need a lot of brilliant ideas to get from 30% to 100%.
Here's a question from William. Mr. Gates has previously stated that nuclear energy is probably the best source of energy, but perceptions of high risk have limited the development of this resource. Does he see a renewed and genuine interest in nuclear energy as time passes?
Yeah, another super good point. The electric sector is going to be mostly renewables, mostly wind and solar, hopefully also offshore wind, because that, like right now in the Midwest of the US, the wind isn't working very well and the solar's not working very well. So if we can have our sources all over the country with lots of transmission, that helps quite a bit with this reliability thing. Unless though we have a breakthrough to store a miraculous amount of energy at this grid level, we will need some sources of energy that are green and don't depend on the weather. And in terms of scale, really only nuclear fission or in the future fusion have a chance to provide that. And so there's several companies that have gotten government money recently. I'm the backer of one called TerraPower that we have a 5-year contract with the government where I provide half of the money and the government the other half. And the demonstration reactor hopefully will solve a lot of the problems nuclear's had. It's had cost problems. It's had safety challenges. It's had where do you put the waste challenges. But by starting from scratch, we and there's other people who are trying other paths on this, we think we can bring nuclear in. And so if it's 20 or 25%, then that makes a big difference in maintaining reliability, even during terrible weather events that renewable sources are unavailable.
That was a great question, William. Thank you. Our next question comes from Pedro, who says, like Trevor, I moved to New York from a developing country, Brazil. Today, living in a country like the US means on average an enormous carbon footprint. How do you reconcile, at least in the short to medium term, the goal of improving the quality of life in developing countries with the state of emergency of the environment?
Well, my answer would be that we really need to multiply by zero. When you can multiply by zero, then the units, it's okay that people are getting basic shelter and more calories and light at night. There's a lot to be done besides multiplying by zero, but our biggest thing should be, what is it that lets you do that? So for example, if you get cheap hydrogen, then you can make steel with no emissions. That's magical. We don't know, but we should, fund projects, catalytic projects, to try and see if we can get those costs to be super low. So I don't think we have, the right to tell developing countries to hold back on doing the basics. We may have the right in the, rich countries to, have to pay for offsets or, somewhat reduce consumption, but it's to make it work on the global basis. That's where that, innovation is absolutely required. So, I wouldn't say to Brazil, okay, you have to have smaller houses or, do less. Some people think, that's the path, but, no more flying, no more beef. I just don't think that's the choice that people will end up making. And so that's where I push towards the innovation as the ability to have both more services for developing countries and no climate change disaster, which actually is worse for developing countries than, because they're near the equator, than it is for the temperate zone rich countries.
Here's a question from Mohammed. Really simple and interesting question. Who inspired you to write this book?
Well, I'm very lucky in that I get to talk to top scientists all the time. There were two professors, Ken Caldera and David Keith, who met with me 5 or 6 times a year, starting in 2005, and they'd bring in experts on climate models, carbon capture, permafrost, batteries. They give me lots of books to read, and I have lots of friends who are in science that are helping me. There's an author, Václav Smil, who's written about the history of energy, and his books are brilliant, so it created that framework. And it's by talking to them that, over this last 15 years, I've gotten, a sense of, okay, what would a plan look like? So I, on my Gates Notes website, I refer to a lot of these books that, have been part of my journey to go, wow, is this really doable? If so, how could you get it done with this deadline, which, innovation usually just wait, only if you have a war or a pandemic or climate change do you kind of say, hey, we have to do unnatural things to make it solve this very quickly.
Here's a question from Catherine. Do you think it was easier to get the world used to the idea of using computers than the idea that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, computers was far easier because, you could show somebody a video game and say, hey, just, mess around. Or you could show them that, hey, instead of using whiteout, when they make a typing mistake, you just hit that backspace key and, it's just gone. Your footnotes show up where they're supposed to be. A lot of the things like, finding music or, opening up maps to try and figure out where you were. It's amazing how the digital tools at very low cost have simplified things. When I was a kid, I read the World Book. First I read A, and it's very strange learning all these A people, and you learn the B people, and it's at different points in time. It's actually kind of confusing. And now, you get timelines and maps. And so, if you're a motivated learner, the digital stuff had so many applications, first in business, but then eventually got cheap enough that just, messing around with your hobby or, trying out new things, eventually it got involved in how you buy things. And of course, the pandemic, the digital companies have actually done well in this because it's kind of forced people to use Zoom and Teams and, buying from e-commerce companies, and so it's even accelerated that revolution. So because you could offer cool things like that, it was inevitable that it would happen. This one, because it's harder to see and grasp the green thing as being better than the normal thing. If you look at a building, you don't know, was it green cement or not?
Our next question comes from Kevin, who says, China is responsible for around 25% of all emissions. Is the Paris Accord sufficient to hold China accountable to reduce emissions?
No, the Paris Accord is not a binding thing. It doesn't create penalties, for people who miss their goals. And the Paris Accord is a super fantastic thing. People may be aware that the next big meeting about those accords was supposed to be last year in Glasgow, but because of the pandemic, just like my book, it got pushed back a year. And so now in November in Glasgow in Scotland, there'll be this coming together of all these countries who hopefully will raise their near-term commitments for these reductions. And they'll sit and talk about, hey, what about cement? Because part of what I've done is starting with Paris, get that innovation track on the agenda. So it's not just the easy stuff that you can do in the near term, it's that hard stuff. China's current commitment is to be zero by 2060, and they still are building new coal plants, they're financing coal plants. They're wealthy enough that we hope they can improve that target, pull it back in time and not finance either domestically or internationally those coal plants. They also can contribute to innovation. So, even when the US and China disagree about some things, hopefully climate, like pandemic work, is something that they see a win-win opportunity. John Kerry is the US climate envoy, and, that's one of his focuses, is to figure out how to get every country involved. But if you had to name, the most important country to get involved, it is China, because you're right, they're number one, although historically, we were way ahead of them, but and then next on that list would be India.
Here's a question from Chris, and this is a really great question. Most Americans have enough present and pressing concerns that they're dealing with right now. How do we expect the average American to care about carbon emissions when they are struggling to make rent or feed their children?
Well, you do rely on government to bring experts to think about hard problems. When Hurricane Sandy hit, it was the poor neighborhoods that just got devastated more than any. When the pandemic hit, and this was a complete surprise to me, racial minorities got infected more, they died more, and we're still, trying to remedy that. And, we don't even fully understand it. It's the jobs they do, is it the multi-generational households, just the density of the housing that they're in. But it's so tragic that almost every dimension of inequity in this country, inner city schools versus suburban schools versus private schools, who got the best online learning? Well, clearly, it's the inner city schools were the least prepared. They have the least internet connections, the least room in the house to go and do those things. And so it's awful when government's failure to anticipate problems actually takes this equity goal, which is right up there. It's what the American government is supposed to be all about. And we're renewing our commitments in that area. Climate is another one where it's those who are worst off are, whether it's here in this country or taking the global view, where Africa, this thing is so bad for Africa. They're not coming and demonstrating here, but climate justice, both domestically and internationally, says that this should be a priority. The percentage of the government resources we need to put into this, if we're clever, it shouldn't have to take away dramatically from other programs. But that's where the debate should be, is about, okay, we have many goals. So let's, what's the most effective way, where that again brings me back to innovation. I don't believe in brute force solutions, because you'd have to defund so many things that aren't even well enough funded already today.
Our final question comes from Bonnie, who asks, how do we foster innovation in our schools?
Well, the idea of motivating kids to learn science because of problems like climate change, can be a win-win, where they find it fascinating. I love this science because it's so interesting how evolution and biology and chemistry and weather, we know a lot, and the history of how people figured these things out. Climate change, even in the 1800s, there were scientists who said, wait a minute, isn't this like a greenhouse where the heat gets trapped inside and it just gets hotter and hotter? And slowly but surely, we figured out, yes, they were right to worry about that. Now it's basically uncontestable. So having more courses that take this as a problem and then give you the background science that connects up to that. We're going to help fund a bit of that, put out some material ourselves through Breakthrough to kind of form a model there. But it's a very good question, because to have a whole generation committed to this and making it easy to be informed and explain things to your peers, that's got to be a necessary part of how we maintain the commitment.
I'll tell you this, the book inspired me to think big. The book inspired me to, I think, to maintain optimism for what we can achieve. And in fact, I've spent a bit of time coming up with a few solutions. I'll just run a few of them by you now. One, I thought we could develop a really big pipe that we connect to space, like a little vacuum valve. And what we do is we just open that every now and again, get some of those gases out of our ozone, and then we can close it back up. I don't know why nobody's ever thought of that, but I guess it's because I've never been part of the solution. I also thought that maybe if we do use more nuclear, what we do is we can put that on Mars instead of sending people to Mars. Let's save the Earth, and we can just keep it on Mars for now. We'll figure out what we do with it later. We just ship some of the nuclear stuff to Mars. And then my last solution was, I was thinking maybe we go down into the core of the Earth, and then we get some of that juice that's in the middle of the planet, and then we use that to heat the planet and change the world. And so these are just some ideas that I have, Bill, and you feel free to use them. I don't care. I know you spend billions on this, and if you want to send $1 billion my way to pay for these ideas, I don't ask you to. You can, but I don't think you should, but you can. But these are just some ideas to help you out. Thank you for writing the book.
The last idea is a good one.
That's okay.
yeah, geothermal. The Mars one is tricky because the power cord between here and Mars would be a very long power cord, and we kind of. But hey, we'll work on it. It's
one out of three is not bad.
Yeah, 1 out of 3. We need a lot of wild ideas. Anybody out there with ideas, this is your opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you for asking the questions. Everybody in the Q&A, we really appreciate you, because as Mr. Gates has said time and time again, this is not an individual problem, it's an everybody problem. And the one thing I always try to remind everybody is the planet is not dying, and the planet will not die. We will die, and the planet will be here laughing at us who are no longer around. So please, let's take this thing seriously. Let's keep having these conversations, and make sure to go out and get the book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. We didn't listen with coronavirus. Maybe we can listen this time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. My name is Trevor Noah. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Trevor.
Mr. Gates, Mr. Noah, thank you for this most inspiring and important conversation. And to all of you who have joined us, enjoy the book and share its message. Be safe and be well. Good night, everyone.